You can support this podcast at patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And on this episode, residents are shocked when hundreds of bodies are found in their Georgia community. For years, the local crematory had not been disposing of loved ones like they should. We'll talk about the true crime podcast, Noble, from Wavland and Campside Media. Joining me to get that done and more is true crime author, TV journalist, and host of These Are Their Stories podcast, my husband, and love of my life, Kevin Flynn. Hi, Kevin.
You just turned that fan on, and it's blowing on me, and it's really cold.
Oh, okay. Let me turn it this way with my foot. Is that better?
Yeah, there you go. A little better.
All right. You'll need it in a little bit because we're sitting real close to each other.
Oh, well, I could just open this door.
Yeah.
But, all right.
But look, I'm sitting slightly behind you.
When I need
Is this good? Is this smart?
When I need the fan, I will tell you I need the fan.
And also with us is private investigator, certified pet detective, resident cat lady, and author of The Final Curtain, Laura Bricker. Hi, Laura.
Hey, Rebecca.
And finally, our captain of all things cynical, author of the City Trilogy of novels, host of Rip Current, Strange Arrivals, and our Patreon Deep Dive Book Club podcast host, Toby Ball. Hi, Toby.
Hey, Rebecca.
Toby, as we record this, it is your podcast publish date. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Very exciting. How do you feel?
It is exciting. And it's one of those exciting where I don't really do much.
Do you feel like a new podcast dad? All proud?
Well, I'm sending out a lot of announcement emails.
Oh,
so
that's exciting. Well, we got one from the PR company.
Yeah.
That was exciting.
Oh.
Pitching us to cover your podcast.
that was from iHeart. I was like, oh, wow, we're on the list.
You are on the list. We get pitched everything.
It's nice to know that it happened because my first book, when that was published, the PR person didn't send them out.
Right. Yep.
So it's nice to get confirmation that it's actually happening.
Yep, been there. Yeah.
All right, so Kevin, this is Monday's podcast.
Yes, it is.
What's coming up on Thursday's program?
On Thursday, we're going to be talking about the Netflix thriller series, A Good Girl's Guide to Murder.
Did you call that a thriller series, Kevin?
Well, that's how it's labeled.
Oh, okay.
Thriller mystery falls into that category.
Okay. I mean, I think we have different definitions of thrillers than the caption writer, whoever wrote that.
Well, you better send a postcard to somebody at Netflix or whatever. Let them know that you disagree with that categorization.
All right, I will. So just before I came downstairs, something really funny happened, guys.
Mm-hmm.
We have a weekly cleaning service that comes to the house so that we can make this podcast. Essentially, it's like they come on really so that we can do this every day, every Thursday. And the woman who comes usually is named Heather. She's freaking awesome. She loves our dogs, and basically she is like, you guys are my favorites because I love your dog so much. She's the best. So she asked if we were going to be taping something interesting, and I was like, yeah, we're taping our regular podcast. You know, it's not like especially interesting, like it's not different than our regular podcast. We're just doing that. She goes, oh, she said, I have another podcaster on my route. And I was like, oh, she goes, I said, what do they podcast about? And she goes, he has a podcast about Bigfoot. And I was like, oh, now that is fucking interesting. And
Toby just leaned forward in his chair. What, Bigfoot?
Yes. And I was like, so what's it called? She's like, I'm not sure, but I got to listen to his end of the whole thing the other day, and I learned so much. And I'm like, God damn it. So now we have to find the New Hampshire podcaster who makes the Bigfoot show, guys. We have to.
Well, there was a guy at the Exeter UFO Festival who has his dual specialty in UFOs and Bigfoots.
Oh,
maybe that's him.
Okay.
And I am gearing up for an exciting event at the end of this month to go to the Sasquatch Calling Contest Festival in upstate New York.
Oh.
So maybe he'll be there.
Maybe he will. I don't know.
That better be a Leave It to Bricker.
Oh, it totally is.
All right,
it totally is.
good.
Yeah.
The Sasquatch Calling Contest.
Yeah, nobody would go with me. And I finally found someone who will. So stay tuned. Mm-hmm.
Good.
Well, I seriously doubt our fellow local podcaster is listening to this. But just in case you are a fellow local podcaster listening to this, and the off chance you are, and you're making a podcast about Bigfoot, get in touch. I want to know who you are so badly. And I want to listen to your show and maybe like get to know you a little bit. It's always nice to know podcasting colleagues. And, if you're podcasting and Heather can hear you, you should probably get in a quieter room. That's all I got to say. That's my one tip to you. All right. So, Kevin,
Yes.
We have a podcast that we need to talk about today. Should we get that done?
Why don't we do that, Rebecca?
All right. I'm going to do that and drop that first clip right now. But I should check first. Is the gas man here? No, I'm just kidding.
Jesus Christ.
Drop that first clip right now. Leading off.
I looked at that long enough to see that that was human body parts and feet and skin, and I just remember one of like a foot with skin and stuff still on it.
Just the foot.
Just the foot.
Working off a tip, investigators in a small Georgia town made a gruesome discovery at Tri-State Crematory. Bodies that were supposed to be cremated were instead dumped around the business's property. The deceased numbered in the hundreds and been left to rot for years.
You start shining a light, just everywhere you look, there was just bodies. Just human bodies just laid there. And various, stages of dress or undress, just however somebody died at the hospital or at home, that's the way they were.
Owner Brent Marsh was charged with several crimes. Meanwhile, loved ones felt re-traumatized, left wondering who or what was really in the urns they had.
Now they have no idea if they've actually fulfilled their obligations to the ones they loved. They have no idea if the bodies were, rather than burned as requested, and treated with dignity and respect, instead buried in a pit, dropped in a trash pile, or shoved in a vault with half a dozen others.
The true crime podcast Noble from Wavland and Campside Media revisits the 2002 Tri-State Crematory scandal. Host Shaun Raviv talks to relatives, lawyers, and investigators about the case and seeks answers as to why Marsh never put hundreds of remains in his oven. Spoiler alert, we are going to be talking about plot points from Noble, so if you want to remain spoiler-free, go to the estimated time code in our show notes for our thumbs up or thumbs down reviews. So, Toby, I want to talk about the opening scene of this podcast. I alluded to it. I made a joke about it, which was probably off color as I was introducing the podcast. But we do have a gas delivery man, in my mind, an incredibly suspenseful retelling of his showing up at this business and just knowing something was off, seeing Brent Marsh, and there just being like a dead body and, just being extremely freaked out. I thought that was a really suspenseful scene and a really great way to set up the story. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it kind of plays like the beginning of a horror movie or something where he kind of shows up and there's nobody around. He's trying to make this delivery and he's not quite sure where to go, but he goes and finds the place and he's looking around and it's like, something seems kind of weird here. He's sort of checking it out. And then this huge guy who's played linebacker and for a Division I college football team shows up and it's kind of like, what's going on?
It takes a few minutes to fill up the propane tank. The two men stand there, silent. Gerald watching his gas meter, pretending he didn't see those body parts, wondering if Brent Marsh saw him see them.
So he does the classic, like, all right, I'm just going to act normal and do my stuff and get the hell out of here. But, the way he tells it, it goes from being like, man, this is weird to like, oh shit, like this could be big trouble. And he does make it out of there. But I thought, it was a really good attention grabber. You don't ease into this one.
No,
it's just like not. Bang.
Yeah.
And so that was good.
Laura, somebody who in your profession shows up to strangers' homes and businesses as part of your defense investigation work, what would you do in this situation?
If I showed up and there was I saw a body?
Yeah, a waxy, decomposing body on a board and somebody just staring at you as you were doing your work and you just didn't know whether you were supposed to look, not look, say something, not say something. What would you do?
Well, so I have a tendency to just sort of strike up conversations in those situations. I'd just be like, so.
And that was the last anyone ever heard of Laura Bricker.
So either I would come up with some conversation because that's how I establish rapport with people. I'll be like, so interesting that you get this dead body here. Or I would just be like, I'm getting the fuck out of here. And I would just smile and nod so as not to, because I'd be like, fuck, what the fuck? The thing with me though is that I have a tracker on my phone so people know where I am. So if I went missing, they would come and find me.
But it might be too late. The stakes are high, Laura Bricker. The stakes are high.
The stakes are high. I would have to read the situation because, I definitely every situation I go into, I take what I call a calculated risk. And if I get in there and I'm like, this doesn't really feel good. This week I was walking around in kind of a neighborhood that was a little rougher. And I said, I don't think I'm going to walk out behind that building to see if door number 3 is back there. I think I'm just going to leave my card on the front mailbox and leave this place. So that might be what I did in that situation as well. Like, I don't do well with smells. So the smell might have already put me off of that whole situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. I thought the opening scene was pretty good. In fact, I'm looking at all of Toby's notes and I agree with all of them. So yeah, I did like that. It's a pivotal moment and they built it with a lot of suspense and drama. I don't know if the rest of the podcast is as good as how it started, but points for strong storytelling out of the gate.
Yeah. What's tough, Toby, I think about a podcast like this when I listen to it, and I'll just say up front, as far as the story goes, which we'll talk about how it's put together, I think about a podcast like this and pitching it and having to sort of get over in that meeting, right? How are you going to talk about bodies? How are you going to talk about decomposition? How are you going to talk about the gruesome details, which are legion in this podcast? And you can't tell a story without talking about those details, because you can't talk about what you found. You can't talk about what people experienced. You can't talk about the scene accurately without going there. And obviously the warnings are at the start of the show, but you know, you're somebody who's pitched stories to podcast companies. Do you find yourself asking that question? Like, how do you even sell a story like this or tell a story like this when you can't avoid those kinds of things?
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, this is one of my questions about this. Is sort of what is the point of all this, or what is kind of the takeaway? I think what they do is clever in that the first couple of episodes, maybe the third episode, I think it's just the first 2, they do these cold opens where they go into quite a bit of detail about various aspects of cremation.
The body lays flat for hours, engulfed in flames, as the crematory furnace reaches 1600 degrees, as hot as molten rock. Our skin, fat, muscles, and organs vaporize at that temperature, but not our bones.
At the time, you're like, oh man, this is like a lot. But then you realize that when it gets to the actual episode, you already kind of understand what the situation is. So they don't have to be constantly giving these sort of lurid descriptions of what they're seeing, because they can just see, we saw a whole bunch of bodies and you kind of have already been brought into what that's going to look like.
The waxiness and so forth, like why bodies look the way they do, smell the way they do, so forth.
Right. So I thought that was clever. As far as, you know, sort of pitching it and being like, all right, this is a story we want to tell. Like there is this hurdle, which is that it's going to be pretty gross, like the whole way through. You know, again, I assume their pitch was, we're going to get that stuff out of the way quickly. We're going to do it in a very sort of clinical manner. And then from there, hopefully we can kind of let that go, talk more about numbers. Occasionally stuff will come up, and occasionally like we'll talk to people who will describe things, but we're not just like pounding you minute after minute after minute with these discussions of bodies in various, you know, states of decay and stuff, because the scene, like, it just feels like it's from like a really sort of trashy horror movie where it's just going full in on the gore, but it's real, right? And so it's just like bodies littering the place, and it's just, I mean, it's quite something. Like if you pause and like really think about what they're talking about, it just seems like a nightmare.
Yeah, it's like a junkyard of bodies, basically, is what it sounds like. It's like car parts, but bodies. Now, Laura, you have a note that it was too much for you.
Yeah. And I'm somebody who, you know, I do crime for work. Like I look at photos and interviews and things that are gruesome. I felt like this level of detail kind of bordered a little bit on trauma porn as I was listening to it. I was like, I understand the decomposition process. I understand that we need to talk about it. I've heard stories, like I've heard stories from the ambulances around here. Oh, we went to go, there was an untimely death and they had been there. We went to pick them up and their arms fell off. Like you hear these stories.
I don't.
I do. I do. I hear these stories.
I don't either, Toby.
Toby, people don't tell you these kind of stories?
I haven't gotten many of those stories.
Don't hang out at the same places as Laura Bricker, apparently.
Yeah. I just felt like this level, like it went on and on and on and on.
The bacteria in your body, no longer kept in check by the immune system, begin to feast. They consume tissue, releasing methane and other gases in the process. Your body bloats, nearly doubles in size. That unmistakable horrid odor of death grows for several days, and soon you can be smelled a quarter mile away.
I understand that it is part of conveying just the monstrosity of the situation. Just, it's gruesome. It's gross. But they could tell the details about like all these like corpses being in that underground vat or whatever it was.
Oh,
like
yeah,
the 7 by 3 vat.
Yeah.
Like you could basically get the gist of how gross that was without all the additional details. So I was kind of like, yeah, no.
Yeah. But it also points to sort of the same about among the four of us, our level of comfort with that detail and confronting the reality that this is what happens when we die. And, how that plays into the way the community viewed these crimes. Was the emotional response and the legal response appropriate to what actually happened here? There's the argument about the criminal mystery here and the argument about the behavioral psychological mystery about why these bodies were not properly disposed of. Laws were broken, but this wasn't a criminal conspiracy. So not asking what's the big deal, but when it's reframed as like, okay, what is the real crime here and what is the appropriate sanction for it? Those are some of the better parts of the discussion.
I want to get to that. That discussion. I think it's a meatier discussion, so I do want to get to that. Can we put a pin in that for a minute?
Well, you're the boss.
Laura, I do want to ask you about a question you had, and you raised it a little bit earlier, about the timing of the telling of this story.
Right.
Do you think this is a timely story, or do you think this is just a story being told for the sake of telling it at this point?
I guess that was kind of what I was frustrated with this podcast. And I say this all the time. Why now? Like, why now? This happened a long time ago. The guy that was convicted is already out of jail. So I'm like, is this like the 20th anniversary thing? And now we're going to tell it because it's a shocking story? Because I was thinking like, okay, here's why I would think it would make sense to tell it now. The guy is finally talking. People around the guy are finally talking. There's been like a lot of changes in regulations and how things are done because of this case. Let's take a look back about how this case changed the landscape of funerals and crematoriums and what is happening with our dead when they die. Like, I guess I just felt like it was just kind of like telling the story from the perspective of how it unfolded through the eyes of the people that were there. But that story was told long ago. So the whole time I'm like, I want to know why. And the host said that he wanted to know why. And I think it was finally like episode 5 or 6 when they're finally like, well, I really want to know why. I'm like, yeah, I've wanted to know why for the last 5 episodes. Why did this happen? What was going on? And then we sort of hear from people around them because they're not able to like talk about it. And you're like, okay, so the dad got Parkinson's and then the son took over and he had to leave college, yada, yada, yada. But I still just felt like if there was some sort of new information, because like if you Google this case, there was things everywhere about it. So there's not necessarily any new information. It just felt like a story to tell because it's shocking,
Yeah, I mean, I think the heart of your question or your thought is that it's much better to have updated and fresh content, like the kind you can get on Patreon.
Yes.
At patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media.
Our Patreon advances the story. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yes, it does.
I'm saying it's always new stuff. We have almost 650 exclusive episodes on our Patreon. Now, you don't have to listen to them all, but we're always adding new stuff. The latest we have on Patreon, well, we have the Crime Writers on After Show.
Yes.
This is what we're going to be talking about this week.
Yeah, I don't know. What are we doing?
What do you want to do with your remains?
Okay.
So we'll talk about, I don't know, and Rebecca, you and I actually have never had a serious discussion about this.
And we should. Literally signing our documents next week.
Let's have it on the podcast.
All right.
Let's do that.
I have something else that I want to follow up on in the after show. Last week I did my rundown of the Village's crime blotter.
Yeah.
I've heard from so many listeners with adjacency to the Villages, and I'm not going to use names, but I have stories.
All right, good. On our podcast, Married with Podcast, we answer a question about a parent who is troubled because her children get attached to the babysitters and then the babysitters leave.
Oh.
And what to do about that. Another great podcast that Rebecca has been doing is the Readathon. This is following the Karen Reed trial. And Rebecca, I gotta ask if you can do this in 3 sentences. The Sandra Birchmore case. What is it and why is it actually important to the Karen Reed case?
The Sandra Birchmore case is the story of a young woman who was murdered, allegedly, by a police officer. Actually, he did it. And basically, the state police in Massachusetts deemed it a suicide. But many of the police officers who investigate it and may have helped cover it up are also involved in the Karen Reed investigation.
because Sandra was found in Canton.
Where is also where John O'Keefe died.
And was there not an Albert involved in the investigation?
Kevin Albert, who's Brian Albert's brother, was the first responder at the Sandra Birchmore scene.
Yeah. Also, you can get Laura's exclusive podcast, Leave It to Bricker. And Laura, you have a return to polo.
Yeah, I had to do an addendum for the first time in Leave It to Bricker history because my second polo playing experience was so different than my first. And I actually got to play. So I felt like I needed to report back on that. I committed a super foul.
Oh.
Some things happened. Unless I have another level of Patreon, I won't be returning to play polo because I found out it really is the sport of kings.
And you're not one.
And I'm not one, but it was quite an adventure. Lance hugged a horse under the tutelage of his mentor, who was trying to get him to be one with the horse for the polo. So it was quite an adventure, and you never know what you can get on a Groupon coupon.
Yeah, I guess Groupon doesn't go as far as the Sport of Kings as one might like. And also, we have another great podcast, and it's Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcast.
Toby, you're saying it wrong. It's Toby Ball's Deep Dive.
Toby Ball's Deep Dive
Book Club podcast. There you go.
It took our wonderful line editor, Livy Burdett, years to figure out that it was like a little.
And then she said to me, she was like, "Do you know that the word balls deep is in Toby's book?" And I was like, "That's on purpose,
yes,
Liv.
Yeah,
On purpose."
Toby's never heard that joke his entire life, and we invented it.
Listeners named it.
The current podcast episode is on the book Bright Young Girls.
Bright Young Women.
What did I have?
These misogynists.
Oh, yeah. Bright Young Women. All right. Well, they started off as bright young girls, but they become bright young women.
Some of them do.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of the book.
Yeah. The whole point of the book. Some of them, not all of them. Yeah.
Oh, it's so fucking dark.
And this is a fictionalized version of the Ted Bundy story from different points of view. Toby, what did you think about the book?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good. It sort of follows these three different women from 2 points of view, and there's one woman who's sort of a common friend of theirs as they deal with one sort of pre-Bundy and one sort of a post-Bundy attack. It just, the psychology of it, and there's a hell of a lot about, gender dynamics back in the 70s and how these women are treated, especially this one who's obviously very smart and capable and has this sort of dumbass boyfriend who still kind of is condescending and, thinks he's driving the ship. Yeah, so it was good. You liked it, Rebecca?
I loved it.
Yeah, Rebecca loved it. I think Allison Horrocks, who was our other panelist, loved it too.
Did she read it like a second time?
She actually recommended it, and I was like, sure. And then so she read it a second time to discuss it.
Now, if you support us on Patreon at the deep dive level, you can watch Toby and his guests record the upcoming podcast. The next one's going to be on September 17th. He's going to be talking about the book, The Wager.
All right, Kevin, should we wrap the business section there, or can I just say one last thing?
Whatever you like.
Subscribe to our newsletter.
Oh,
because it's free, it's awesome, and it's chock full of good stuff. And you can do that at crimewriterson.com and get Kevin's innermost thoughts in our newsletter. So I recommend you do that. Kevin, does thus end the business section?
Thus ends the business section.
I'm going to go ahead and fade that music out right now. So, Toby, I put a pin in this before, but I'd like to unpin it now.
Okay.
One thing that I love about this podcast is it asks the hard question. And it's a question that I know that you've had before and that I've had before, because we talked about it with another podcast that we talked about, which is essentially, who cares what happens to your body after you die?
Right.
You're dead. And why do we make such a big deal out of it? Like, really? And I think that is a perfectly fair question, because that is kind of what Brent Marsh's lawyer was going to get to in court, right? Was going to be part of his defense, was like, is this a crime? I mean, yes, he didn't do the service he said he was going to do, but is that a business crime? And does it end there? Because essentially, these folks are dead. And why do we put so much weight on what happens to bodies when folks are dead? I think that's a fair question. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about it. I was thinking about, those Enron guys who were like screwing old ladies out of their retirement to pay extra for their electric bills and stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's like, how do you weigh that kind of thing? Like ruining somebody's who's living life versus mishandling a dead person. And, I kind of fall on the punish the people who are harming the living. The living in this case are the people who survive the deaths of their loved ones. like, I don't have like that kind of spiritual attachment to my body. Like when I die, like if they want to use my body for, med school practice or something, that's absolutely fine.
Don't give away the after show.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll go into much greater detail in the after show. It's an interesting thing in that it's sort of this collision of sort of religious beliefs, public health, and how you dispose of bodies, and the law, right? And so in some cases, and I think this seems to be the case in this community, is the religious beliefs around the sacredness of the body, how you deal with the body, is really a lot stronger than sort of what legal culpability might be. That makes it sort of this combination of like highly fraught, but also kind of low stakes in my mind. So anyway, it's a tough one. Like, I am not a great person to comment upon it because I kind of feel like cremains, there's like a symbolic aspect to it, which I think is important. But whether like every single coarse grain or pebble or whatever they described it as being happens to be from the physical body of that person or not, I can't get super worked up about that, but I understand that other people do.
People do in certain religions and cultures, fine. Right? They do. And they also do in certain aspects of our society. I mean, look at the conversations around military dead and honoring military dead and the sanctity of those graves and those bodies. I mean, we definitely kind of, as a society, rank and value human remains differently depending on sort of who they are, where they are, what they are. I more personally am along the lines of you, Toby. Like, I don't understand it. Doesn't mean that I don't understand that other people do. But Laura, what are your thoughts there? Because this is a big why in the podcast.
Yeah, it's hard because I think I'm squeamish about it. So I think that makes me feel like I want to like follow sort of these protocols of like making sure that everybody is treated with respect when their body is there and they are not. In my rational brain, I'm like, well, why does that matter? Because at that point, you're basically just dead and you're not really that person anymore. But there's something about it that is, like Toby said, sort of symbolic. Like when my grandmother died, she had been on hospice and she was not looking well at all at the end. Before the funeral home director came to pick her up, I had the hospice nurses change her, bathe her, and put her in a lovely blue dress so that she left looking like the way she would have wanted to look. And for me, that was something that was important to do. And she was cremated. But again, I think it's kind of case by case and person by person because we all have such personal feelings about this. I don't think it's something that you can really put in a box and categorize because I think it affects everybody very differently and differently depending on who the deceased is as well.
Yeah, I think, Laura, you nailed it with your story about your Nana's blue dress, that was really more for you, right? And the things that we do here are really more for us, the survivors. And so when it comes to like who this crime was perpetrated against, it's not really the remains of these people, right? It's really the victims impacted are the loved ones because they've already sort of gone through whatever stages of grief they have gone through with the loss of this person. And then it sort of re-traumatizes them. You know, sometimes when people die, like we have all sorts of regrets about what we did to them or what we could have done better for them when they were alive. And then to sort of see this, right, it gives you somebody other than your creator to be angry with about their death, right? So I think the things that we do, you know, the ways that we view the remains, we respect them, we honor the dead, you know, all of our feelings in regards to the actual body, you know, it's different, right? And in a lot of places, it's like, we're there for births. And in a lot of other cultures, they're there for the death too, right? And a lot of that we don't want to see the dead. We put them in a closed casket. To see the body itself, even in a natural state, is very traumatizing, or at least it's discomforting for a lot of people because that isn't sort of part of our culture. You know, even the Irish don't like stretch out the guy on the dining room table anymore. Which the American Irish do, but we sort of do.
The open casket is kind of like that.
Yeah, but we're not drinking Guinness on top of them, you know, anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. I'm sure if someone, we always say like an Irish wake is exactly like an Irish wedding, except one fewer person. And so, so in some cultures it's there, but some cultures it's not. And you want you're leaving this task to professionals.
Yeah.
And so to find out that something went wrong is disheartening in a lot of different ways. And that's how what did one of the townspeople here affected, they wanted the guy to go to jail for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
As if he killed. Well, what was the original charge? It's 8,000 years or something that. When they combine it up.
4 times since Christ walked the earth, which is how his lawyer put it, which was a really smart way to put it.
Yeah,
in
it's a good framing device. It's a good framing device. But I think in the end, one of the telling thing was where it was this tort law case from the state of Georgia. That judge sort of ruled that, the body is not property, but it's also a very mysterious thing.
The judge in that case wrote in his opinion, "A corpse in some respects is the strangest thing on earth. A man who but yesterday breathed and thought and walked among us has passed away. Something is gone. The body is left still and cold, and is all that is visible to mortal eye of the man we knew. It is not surprising that the law relating to this mystery of what death leaves behind cannot be precisely brought within the letter of all the rules regarding corn, lumber, and pig iron."
A lot of this is not really based on what the criminal law is, because it seems to be, in the end, when he gets 12 years, that's significant, but it's not 8,000. And I think it's because we have to really reframe this about what is the actual criminal accountability here, and how much of this is just sort of amplified by our own grief and our own views about what happens to our loved ones once they've passed.
You actually, what you talked about just then, it sums up what Sheila went through after her husband Ira died.
Yeah.
Because she went through the whole grief process, because she also grieved him while he was alive, because she took care of him when he was ill. So she went through the whole grief.
Unwrapped those Hershey's Kisses.
And then he got very ill. She took care of him. He died. She thought she cremated him. She visited where she spread his ashes all the time. She spent time with his memory, not with his body, with his memory. And then she found out he wasn't really cremated, and she was re-traumatized because it was sort of like it happened again. But then she processed it again and realized he was gone again, and she could forgive. And she's the only one who sort of went through that whole cycle again completely. And that was very interesting, because she's right. She's like, he's still gone. My life hasn't changed. And that was the thing that I think, she's the one who came to realize he probably was just overwhelmed. He didn't want to have this business to begin with. He was underwater and he couldn't do it, and he didn't want to do it. And that's a very logical way to think about it. But she's also the only one who realized her life hadn't changed by the fact that her husband hadn't actually been cremated. And so to not forgive him was kind of like only hurting herself, which I thought was very interesting. One character I want to talk about before we wrap, I think it's really important because you all have notes about him, is Brent Marsh's attorney, McCracken Poston. Laura, your thoughts on this attorney?
First of all, he has the best name ever. Ever for an attorney. He's a fictional defense attorney. But I think he's kind of a quintessential defense attorney in the reason he takes on the case and his feelings about why he takes on the case, because he's taking on somebody that everybody else at that point absolutely hates, that they find despicable, because he's everybody deserves a defense. And I say this all the time.
The way they charged him, the potential sentencing was over 8,000 years. Now, my reaction was 4 times the time since Jesus walked the earth is excessive.
He wanted to defend him because he knew the family. He knew the father who we now know was sick and wasn't well at that time. He's looking at the news and he's seeing the way this guy's being portrayed. And he's there's got to be more to this story. And he gets involved. And I still want to know what the more to the story part was, but he was a very flamboyant sort of one of those outspoken defense attorneys. And I thought it was super interesting when Marsh gets out of prison in 2016. This is the guy that goes to pick him up in his big Ford pickup truck. And he's out there and again, and he's still standing by him. And so I thought, you know what, regardless of how this happened, this was his advocate. And it was somebody that was really quite a character.
Yeah, I love the fact that he decided to take the case as kind of a fuck you to his community. After he ran for Congress as a Democrat all those years ago, and things kept changing to today. They've got Marjorie Taylor Greene. And so the idea that everyone's going to be pissed about this, so I may as well do it.
Yeah. Toby, he offers this potential explanation, which I'm not sure he buys and the host doesn't buy, but, it is a potential explanation about there being mercury poisoning, something going on with his client's brain at the time. What are your thoughts here? I mean, do you think that Brent Marsh...
The S-Town defense.
I was about to say, he listens to podcasts.
Do you think that maybe Brent Marsh had, a temporary disability of some kind? Do you think Brent Marsh just didn't want to do the business and got caught underwater? Like, do you have thoughts after listening to this story about what may have been going on here?
Yeah, I've got no idea. In Sheila's case, it seems like she definitely has a conversation with one of her sons and then projects that onto the defendant.
You had gone through somewhat of a similar thing as Brent. Brent's father was sick for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
He and, his mother
and
helped
the
take care
mother
of him.
was left holding it, and, she couldn't do it, so she had to ask him if he would do it. And being the good, obedient son, he done it.
The mercury poisoning seems like something that you come up with if you're a defense attorney and and things aren't looking good from a just pure evidence standpoint. And it's that old, if you don't have the facts, argue the law type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Not for nothing, but those other heavy metals aren't good for you either. The ones they found in his hair.
So you come up with that. So I don't know. They both seem to have more to do with the people who are sort of putting it forward, like either their sort of mindset or their position in regards to the case, than having much insight. And since you don't hear from him, at least so far, I just don't know what you could base something on other than kind of what you want to have happen, like whether you want him to be punished or like, that guy, he was just, he didn't give a shit, or, I think people are being rough on him. He can't possibly quite that bad. I don't really know.
You buy it, Kevin? Mercury poisoning?
I don't know, but I think that it's important. I think it was good that Shaun was transparent on his feelings about it, but he certainly just presented that in a very transparent, fair, factual, even way. I think for the most part, a lot of people would have taken this podcast and gone down the investigator's point of view. I think that the balance of the podcast is actually sort of looking at the exculpatory information about Brent, and he could have just been cast as this villain and been very two-dimensional, and that's it. But I think that, he gives a fair shake to his side and his point of view on this.
All right, let's do what we do. Let's let our listeners know, should they check out Noble? What do you think, Laura Bricker? Thumbs up or thumbs down for this podcast?
I'm going to go mild thumbs up. My critique of this podcast is that I guess I just feel like what I'm going to just call some trauma porn in terms of the level of description that we got. And also, given the amount of time that had passed since this crime occurred, I was waiting for a little bit more context as to why we were hearing this story now. But that being said, I just kept listening because I was like, oh my God, what is going to happen next? Oh my God. There was a lot of holy shit, I can't believe all the things that are happening related to this being in a very small town. I think they said 300 people. As somebody who grew up in a very small town, I was thinking about wow, how would that play out? How would that have played out in this little town I grew up, where the people that are going to talk to this man who, is behind this whole crematorium, they know him because everybody knows everybody. And just thinking about Georgia and where this happened. I mean, it was interesting. I didn't love it, but I think it was still well done. So a mild thumbs up.
Toby Ball, thumbs up or thumbs down for the podcast Noble?
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with a lot of what Laura said in that I'm sort of a mild thumbs up. I think it's well done. It's well written. I think they've got interesting interviews. I mean, I think the subject, there's no getting around sort of the trauma and sort of body horror stuff. I mean, that's just kind of baked in. So if you decide you're going to do this, that's going to be part of it. And that's sort of part and parcel. And if you don't want to hear that, this probably isn't your podcast. I mean, I guess not that people do want to hear it, but if it's going to really traumatize you, I wouldn't necessarily listen to this. In the end, the question that I really wanted answered was, what are we supposed to make of this? We kind of touch on some of the interesting questions, I think, and some of them sort of get brought up, but it didn't seem like there was a strong authorial voice making the questions a little more explicit and kind of bringing up what the issues surrounding it are, and even maybe contextualizing it a little bit. I don't think we heard from clergy or historians or anything like that to kind of talk about what the culture of the area is. I mean, you heard a little bit about how in the South, there's more burials than in the North, but that cremation's sort of catching on more and more. But I think getting a little bit more of the mindset of the people who are so outraged would have been helpful for me. But, you know, again, I mean, it's not a bad podcast. And I think there's a lot of good aspects to it, which is why I give it a mild thumbs up.
Kevin Flynn, thumbs up or thumbs down for Noble?
I'm actually going to go thumb sideways on this. I'm really pulling for this podcast company, this new podcast company, Wavland. They did Drowning Creek last week. And I got to say, like, they are very ambitious. And I think that that's great. And they seem to have some quality journalists that are taking these on, but they still kind of feel a little mid to me. Yeah, like Toby said, as far as the authorial voice, I felt like perhaps that was missing. And, you know, beyond the fact that this, you know, involved so many bodies, I'm like really wondering what the interesting story is beyond that. I think that we got into some interesting things about the Marsh family in episode 6, and maybe could have gone a little more into the context about, you know, the racial makeup, or the racial impact that this might have had as far as the way people viewed it. And then when we got to episode 7, you know, sort of looking at different aspects of the case, I found that really interesting. But again, we're talking about episode 6 and 7. So I think it's good, but fine. It doesn't really stand out for me. So I'm not going to give it a thumbs down, but I'm going to stick with sideways.
I'm doing a mild thumbs up for Noble. The podcast is well written, well edited. It's a story that I think is just really hard to think about, you know, 100%. Like, why are we hearing it right now? I agree with Laura on that, but also it's hard to get through. Some of the details of this are just really, really hard to listen to. What saves the podcast for me is a story of a particular woman that we hear in the podcast. What also saves it is hearing the origin story of the perpetrator in the podcast. That's handled really, really well. We didn't talk about it a ton in the review portion of the podcast, but hearing sort of the historical context of the story was very helpful for me. And there's a really, really great opening scene, and there's a really, really great lawyer. So for me, those were like the saving graces that made it go from sideways to mild up. That and the very, very strong writing, editing, sound design, delivery. Without the package, this would have been a sideways for 100%. So yeah, mild thumbs up for me for Noble. Now it's time for my favorite part of the podcast, a little something I like to call the Crime of the Week. The woman who conned high society as Anna Delvey has a new hustle. She'll be one of the celebrities on the new season of Dancing with the Stars next week. The subject of the Inventing Anna series will do her cha-cha-cha with the ankle bracelet she's required to wear before her pending deportation case. It's unclear how flying to Los Angeles to compete will jive with her house arrest conditions in New York, but we all know that Anna is very VIP. Other dancing stars this season include Tori Spelling, Eric Roberts, and 3 of Kevin's favorites, former Patriots receiver Danny Amendola, diehard actor Reginald Vell-Johnson, and swimsuit model Brooks Nader.
Oh, yeah.
We'll see if Delvey tries to get into their heads by telling them they look poor, or asking if they're pregnant or just so very, very fat. So panel, let's get ready to rumba. What song should Anna Delvey strut her stuff to on Dancing with the Stars? What do you think, Laura Bricker?
I had friends texting me about this when this came out. We were all so excited. I'm like, I can't wait. Number 1. Number 2, I think it's going to be another good fake, Milli Vanilli.
Oh, not bad. Toby Ball, what song do you think Anna Delvey should strut her stuff to on Dancing with the Stars?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that Danny Amendola is going to be on Dancing with the Stars. Like, no shade to him, but he was about as obscure a football player as
not to Kevin.
Or Miami,
I mean, for a guy who was a starter. I'm turn back the clock a little bit. I think Steve Miller's "Take the Money and Run" would be my guess.
Not bad. What do you think, Kevin? What song should Anna Delvey strut her stuff to on Dancing with the Stars?
I think Unchained Melody, with the emphasis on unchained.
All right. Well, I'm not going to even go for this one. Laura Bricker, if folks want to reach out to you and make their song list suggestions for the Anna Delvey Spotify playlist, how can they find you on social media?
They can find me at Laura Bricker on Instagram and Twitter.
And Toby Ball, folks are listening to Rip Current and want to send you their thoughts and kudos. How can they find you online?
At Toby Ball NH.
And where can you be found on Instagram, Toby?
I can be found at Toby Ball 603, and I will probably start doing stuff on Instagram
All right. What
This
about
is for the guy with 2 Instagram
I know.
accounts.
I've got
so
2
obscure.
I've got a burner account. I got a real account.
It's a Finsta
He has
with
a
the same
Finsta.
name. It's not.
Yeah. It's not a good burner account.
I know. What about you, Kevin? How can you be found?
I'm at Kevin P. Flynn.
If you want to follow me everywhere, I always go by the same handle. It's Reb Lavoie. You can follow the show everywhere at the same handle, Crime Writers On. But mostly I encourage you to join our incredible Facebook group. Even if you don't use Facebook a lot, you're going to love this group. Everyone is awesome. Get episodes early and ad-free at patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. You'll get everything we make for the Patreon firewall back there. You're going to love it. Our theme song was composed and performed by Ty Gibbons. Our editor is the terrific Livy Burdett. The executive producer of this show is Kevin Flynn. This show was recorded in Studio C, The Closet, in our New Hampshire basement, where I also unwrap all of Kevin's Hershey's Kisses.
That's how it gets sticky, though.
On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so
Oh,
much for
my
listening.
fingers.
We'll catch you later. As far as this story goes, and we'll talk about the story itself and the bones of it and so forth. Oh, I shouldn't say that. We'll talk about the story itself.
The bones and melting flesh. And
You mean the mushy bones?
Oh, God. Okay.
Let's find the real muscle here.
Oh, Jesus
And the
Christ.
sinew.
As far as the
You
story...
can talk about the skeleton of the story, too.
Jesus Christ. Okay.
The
backbone.
spine. Very good.
Okay.
Partners in Crime Media.